The Arizona sun doesn't just shine, it punishes. It beats down on the cracked earth until the whole world shimmers and shakes. And out in that punishing heat, Sarah Thompson was all alone. 6 months. 6 months since the fever took her husband James, and left her with nothing but a 10-year-old son, a failing homestead, and a grief so heavy it felt like a second sun beating down on her heart. She was hanging laundry, the simple motion of clothespins a familiar comfort, when her son Thomas shouted from the edge of the scrub brush, "Ma, look!" He held up a skinny rabbit, its life already gone, caught in one of his clumsy little traps. He was so proud. He had his father's sandy hair, his father's hopeful eyes. It was like looking at a ghost. Sarah forced a smile that felt like cracking clay. "Well done, Tommy. That'll make a fine stew." The boy's face fell, just a little. "Pa would have shown me how to skin it proper." The words were a punch to the gut. Every day was a new reminder of what they'd lost, of the gaping hole James had left behind, a hole she could never fill. "I'll help you," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Just like your father showed me." Later, as they worked, Thomas asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Ma, why don't we ever see any Indians?" He'd heard stories in town, whispers of the Apache who lived in the mountains, ghosts in the hills. "They keep to themselves mostly," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. "And that's for the best. Times are changing, Tommy." But she knew the truth. The railroad was coming. More settlers. The world was shrinking, and there was no room for ghosts. That night, with Thomas asleep, she took her usual spot on the porch. The rifle felt heavy and familiar across her lap. It was her only companion in the dark. The coyotes howled their lonely song, and Sarah thought about selling the place, about giving up on James's dream. It was too much. She was breaking under the weight of it all, and that's when she heard it, the snap of a single twig in the dead quiet of the desert night. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't the wind. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't alone. She raised the rifle, the cool metal a stark contrast to her sweating palms, and pointed it into the shadows. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "Who's there?" A deep voice answered from the darkness, calm and steady. "I mean, no harm." A figure stepped out of the shadows and into the pale moonlight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his skin the color of polished copper. An Apache. His hands were raised, open and empty. But Sarah didn't move. She kept the rifle aimed right at his chest. "State your business," she commanded, her voice shaking only slightly. The man wore a mix of his people's clothes and the white man's. A tattered army blanket was draped over his shoulders. He took another slow step forward. "My name is Nako. It means warrior." His English was perfect, almost unnervingly so. "I have twin daughters. Their mother, she died 3 days ago. From the fever." Sarah's grip on the rifle faltered for just a second. The same fever that had taken James. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her voice cold. "But what does that have to do with me?" The man's face, which had been a mask of stone, suddenly cracked with desperation. It was a look she knew all too well. She saw it in her own reflection every morning. "The babies," he said, his voice raw. "They need milk. They will not survive." Sarah's mind reeled. What did he want from her? What could she possibly do? "I heard there was a woman here," he continued, his dark eyes pleading with her. "A kind woman who recently lost her husband." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Who told you that?" she demanded. "The trader. Williams," he answered. "He said you might help." Williams, the kindly shopkeeper in town. How could he send this man here, to her isolated homestead, in the middle of the night? Nako pressed on, seeing the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I have skills. I can hunt for you. Teach your boy the ways of the wild. Protect this place." He took a breath. "In return, you help me feed my daughters." The offer hung in the air, a dangerous and impossible proposition. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to go, to leave her to her grief. But then he said the one thing that changed everything. He wasn't asking for her to nurse them. He knew that was impossible. "Goat's milk," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have seen you have goats. They're mother's sister. She tried, but she has gone with the others. To the reservation. I will not go there. It is a place of death." Sarah looked at this proud, desperate man. She saw the same grief in his eyes that lived in her own heart. She thought of two tiny motherless babies, starving somewhere out there in the dark. Her resolve crumbled. "Where are they?" she asked. "Your daughters?" His eyes never left hers. "Hidden. Safe. I would not bring them into danger until I knew you would not shoot." Sarah lowered the rifle. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Bring them here," she said, the words feeling like they belonged to someone else. "I have goat's milk. We'll figure something out for tonight." Relief washed over the warrior's face, so profound it was like watching a mountain crumble. He vanished back into the darkness. When he returned, he was carrying a small deerskin bundle. And from that bundle came the faintest, weakest cry Sarah had ever heard. It was the sound of a life on the very edge of being extinguished. Sarah led him inside, her hands trembling as she lit a lamp. "Let me see them," she whispered. Nako carefully unwrapped the bundle on the rough-hewn kitchen table. Two tiny infants, smaller than any babies she had ever seen, lay nestled in the furs. Their copper skin was stretched tight over their tiny bones, and their black hair was just a soft fuzz on their heads. Their cries were thin and reedy, like wounded birds. They were fading. "They need feeding. Now," Sarah said, snapping into action. The grief and fear were replaced by a sudden, fierce purpose. She warmed the goat's milk, her movements swift and sure. She fashioned two small feeders from scraps of clean cloth. "What are their names?" she asked as she worked. "Ayana and Kiona," Nako replied, his voice thick with emotion. He watched her every move, his stoic mask completely gone. "Eternal Blossom and Brown Hills." Sarah showed him how to hold the feeder, how to gently squeeze a few drops into Ayana's mouth. The tiny baby latched on with a surprising strength, her little hands reaching, grasping. Kiona was weaker, but soon she was drinking too. For the first time in a long time, the silence of the cabin was filled not with sorrow, but with the soft sounds of life. Nako's shoulders slumped. "You saved their lives tonight." His voice was quiet, full of a gratitude that needed no other words. "For tonight," Sarah said, her gaze meeting his over the lamplight. "But this isn't a solution. They need more than I can give." She thought of the Indian agent in town, the proper channels. The reservation. "No," he interrupted, his voice like flint. "I told you. The reservation is death. A slow death, maybe, but death all the same. They rot the spirit, then the body." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "The agent there, a man named Cutler. He sells the government rations meant for our children and keeps the gold. He lets them starve. I will not take my daughters there to die for his profit." So it wasn't just a principle. It was a specific man, a specific evil. This changed things. "Then what do you propose?" Sarah asked, her mind racing. "I told you. I will build a shelter nearby. I will hunt for this house. I will guard it. I will teach your boy to be a man, as his father would have." His eyes held hers, and in them she saw not a savage, but a father making a promise. "And you will help me keep my daughters alive." Sarah knew she should say no. It was madness. Having an Apache living on her land would bring nothing but trouble. Talk. The sheriff. Danger. But then she looked down at the two tiny girls, sleeping now, their bellies full for the first time in days. She looked at their father, a man stripped of everything but his love for them. How could she turn them away? "1 week," she said, the words tasting like a gamble. "You can stay for 1 week. We'll see how it goes. After that, no promises." He nodded, accepting her terms. As the night deepened, she showed him a place in the barn where he and the twins could sleep. She returned to the quiet house, the rifle back in its place by the door. She looked in on Thomas, sleeping peacefully, unaware of how their lives had just been turned upside down. What had she done? She had invited the wilderness onto her doorstep. She had made a pact with a stranger. And as she lay in her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds from the barn, she had a sinking feeling that this 1 week was either going to save them all or get them all killed. The sun rose, painting the mountains in hues of pink and gold, but Sarah felt none of its warmth. She hadn't slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle in the grass, had sent a jolt of fear through her. She rose before dawn, steeling herself to face the consequences of her late-night decision. When she stepped outside, the air crisp and cool, she expected to find him sleeping in the barn. Instead, Nako was already at work. At the far edge of her property, near the cottonwood trees that lined the dry creek bed, he was building a shelter. It was a simple lean-to, but he worked with a speed and efficiency that was mesmerizing. The twin girls were nearby, sleeping in a cradle he'd fashioned from a basket and some furs, shaded from the coming sun. "You work fast," Sarah said, her voice startling him. He didn't jump. He simply turned, nodding. "The sun will be hot soon. The babies need shade." His hands never stopped moving, weaving branches and securing them with strips of yucca fiber. "Is your boy still asleep?" "Yes," she said. I'm not sure how to explain this to him." Nako paused his work and looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her anxiety. "The truth is always best," he said simply. "Children understand more than we think they do." Sarah wasn't so sure. She held up a small basket. "I brought breakfast, and more milk for the babies." As if on cue, a small cry came from the cradle. Nako moved to it with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his powerful frame. He lifted the fussing infant, cradling her against his chest. "This is Ayana. She always wakes first." A rare, small smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines of grief and worry. As Sarah showed him again how to warm the milk just right, she found herself asking, "How did you learn to speak English so well?" His face hardened again, the smile vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "I was taken to a mission school when I was a boy." He stared off at the mountains. "I ran away after 2 winters, but I learned enough. Learned to understand the white man's lies. It is important for survival." A shout from the house cut through the morning quiet. "Thomas." He stood on the back porch, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Ma! There's an Indian out here!" he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Nako. Sarah took a deep breath. "It's all right, Tommy. Come and meet our guests." Thomas crept forward, never straying more than an arm's length from his mother. He stared at the tall Apache warrior, who stood perfectly still, holding his tiny daughter. "This is Nako," Sarah said. "He and his daughters, Ayana and Kiona, are going to be staying with us for a little while." Thomas's eyes were like saucers. "Are you a real warrior?" he breathed. Nako gave a solemn nod. "I was. Now, I am a father." "Where's their ma?" Thomas asked, his childish curiosity overriding his fear. "She walks with the spirits now," Nako answered, his voice soft. Understanding dawned on Thomas's face. "Like my pa." The fear was gone, replaced by a sudden, heartbreaking empathy. He stepped closer, peering at the tiny baby in Nako's arms. "They're awful small." Sarah saw her chance. "Kiona is waking up," she said, nodding to the other twin, who was beginning to fuss. "Would you like to help feed her?" To her surprise, Thomas nodded eagerly. With Sarah guiding his hands, he carefully held the small cloth feeder to the baby's lips. The tiny girl drank, her little hand wrapping around Thomas's finger. A huge grin spread across her son's face. "She's strong. She's grabbing my finger." In that moment, watching her son connect with this motherless child, a tiny bit of the tension in Sarah's chest eased. After the babies were fed and sleeping again, Nako turned his attention to Thomas. Your mother tells me you wish to learn the hunt. Thomas's eyes lit up as if the sun had risen a second time just for him. Yes, sir. Pa was teaching me, but his voice trailed off. We begin today, Nako said. Simple lessons first. He glanced at Sarah. A silent question. She hesitated for only a second before nodding. Stay within shouting distance of the house. As the days slid by, a strange new rhythm took hold. Every morning, Nako and Thomas would disappear into the brush. Sarah would watch them go, her son practically bouncing with excitement, following in the footsteps of the silent Apache warrior. He was learning to read tracks, to move without a sound, to understand the secret language of the wilderness. He was learning the things James would have taught him. While they were gone, Sarah cared for the twins. She found a surprising joy in their presence. The house was no longer silent and empty. It was filled with the small, demanding sounds of new life. In the evenings, they would all share a meal. Nako would bring fresh game, rabbit or quail, and they would eat together on the porch, watching the sky bleed purple and orange. It was almost peaceful, too peaceful. On the fifth day, Sarah was hanging laundry, the same chore she'd been doing when her world turned upside down, when she saw them. 3 riders, kicking up a cloud of dust as they approached her property. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was Sheriff Mills, and he wasn't alone. Thomas, she yelled, her voice sharp with alarm. Get inside. Take the babies to the back room and stay quiet. Do not make a sound. She grabbed the rifle from its place by the door and walked to the edge of her property, her face set like stone. She would not let them see her fear. Sheriff Mills tipped his hat, but his eyes were hard. Afternoon, Mrs. Thompson. Words reach town. Sounds like you've got yourself an Indian problem. No problem here, Sheriff, Sarah said, her voice steady. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the rifle. Williams, down at the trading post, he says you've been buying a peculiar amount of goat's milk. Baby things. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, scanning her property. Says he's seen an Apache brave coming and going from here. One of the other men, a sour-faced rancher named Frank Doyle, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. Ain't proper, he sneered. A white woman all alone out here with a savage. My arrangements are my own business, Mr. Doyle, Sarah snapped, her temper flaring. He's been helping me. With hunting, with repairs. Things I can't do on my own. Sarah, be reasonable, the sheriff said, his voice taking on a placating tone she didn't trust. There's a reservation for his kind. It's for their own good. If he's got little ones, they belong there too. And what about my good? Sarah shot back, her voice rising. Since James died, this place has been one broken fence away from falling apart. Now, for the first time, I have help. My son is learning things a boy needs to know. The third man, Peterson, chimed in. What happens when more of them show up? You think they'll all be so helpful? One Indian leads to 10, then 100. He's alone, Sarah insisted, her voice cracking. Except for his babies. Their mother died. They would have died too if I hadn't helped. The sheriff shook his head, his face a mask of weary duty. I'm sorry, Sarah, but I have my orders. The Army's cracking down after those raids last spring. All Apache not on the reservation are to be brought in, no exceptions. He had nothing to do with those raids, she argued, though a cold knot of doubt formed in her stomach. How could she know for sure? Where is he now? The sheriff demanded. It was as if the question itself had summoned him. Nako emerged from the trees, silent as a shadow. Thomas was at his side. They carried a string of rabbits for that night's supper. Seeing the armed men, Nako stopped instantly, his body going rigid. He placed a protective hand on Thomas's shoulder. Go to your mother, boy, Sheriff Mills called out. Thomas looked from Nako to the sheriff, then to his mother, his face a mess of confusion. It's all right, Tommy, Sarah said, her voice softer now. Come here. As Thomas ran to her side, the sheriff dismounted, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. You're coming with us, he said to Nako. Orders. Nako stood tall, his face unreadable. My daughters are inside, he said, his voice calm and even. They are too small for such a journey. We'll see they get proper care, the sheriff replied, but his words rang hollow. Everyone knew what proper care meant on the reservation. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between the sheriff and Nako. "Please, Sheriff, just give us some time. Until the end of summer. The babies are too fragile. I'll take full responsibility." "Can't do it, Sarah," he said, shaking his head. "The law is the law." A desperate, reckless idea exploded in Sarah's mind. "Then I'll go to the territorial governor," she declared, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't feel. "I'll write to every newspaper from here to California. I'll ask them what kind of men tear newborn babies from their father's arms. I'll ask them if they'd do the same if those babies were white." The sheriff's face darkened. The other men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Doyle looked like he wanted to spit but held back. Sarah saw her opening and pressed harder. "3 weeks," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Just give us 3 weeks. The babies will be stronger then. We can make arrangements." Sheriff Mills stared at her for a long, hard moment. He looked at the rifle in her hands, at the determined set of her jaw. He sighed, a long drawn-out sound of defeat. 3 weeks, he conceded, his voice tight with anger. He swung himself back onto his horse. "Then he goes to the reservation, willingly or not." He pointed a finger at her. "And I'll be back, Mrs. Thompson. Don't make me bring more men next time." As the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, the strength seemed to drain out of Sarah's legs. She leaned against a fence post, her body trembling. Thomas ran inside to check on the twins. Nako approached her slowly, his face grim. "You risk much for us," he said quietly. "Why?" Sarah lifted her head and met his gaze. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said. "And because you've kept your word to me." That night, after Thomas was in bed, Sarah found Nako sitting outside his lean-to, staring up at the blanket of stars. "They'll be back," she said, sitting near him. "Yes," he replied, his voice heavy. "What will you do?" she asked. He was silent for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the desert. "There are places," he said finally. "Hidden places in the mountains where the white man does not go. But the journey. It would be hard on the little ones. They might not survive it." Sarah looked at the small, fragile shelter he had built. She looked at the house her husband had built. Both were so vulnerable. Both could be lost in an instant. Running wasn't the answer. Fighting wasn't the answer. They were trapped. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "What if there was another way?" she asked, the words hanging in the cool night air. "A way to fight them without rifles? A way to use their own laws against them?" The 3-week reprieve felt less like a gift, and more like a ticking clock. Every sunset was a reminder that their time was running out. The night Sarah had proposed her crazy idea, neither of she nor Nako had slept. The plan was a wild, desperate gamble, and the morning light did nothing to make it seem any saner. "You have thought more on your words?" Nako asked, as he helped her mend a broken fence line. His voice was low, his eyes fixed on his work, but she could feel his tension. "I've thought of little else," Sarah admitted, glancing back at the house where Thomas was watching the twins. "The sheriff wasn't giving us 3 weeks to make arrangements. He was giving us 3 weeks to surrender. He'll be back, and he'll bring more men. We need a plan that doesn't involve running or fighting." "And your plan is—" "Marriage," he said, the word sounding strange and foreign in his mouth. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "It would be on paper only," she said quickly, feeling a strange need to justify it. "A business arrangement. If you are legally my husband, and this homestead is legally yours too, they can't force you onto the reservation. The law protects a man's property. The law protects a family." "The white man's law protects such a union?" he asked, his voice laced with a skepticism born from a lifetime of broken treaties and false promises. "Not everywhere," Sarah admitted. "But I've heard stories. The territorial judge in Prescott, James, served on a jury for him once. He said Judge Harrison was a fair man. A man who believed in the letter of the law, not just the color of a man's skin. If we can get to him, if we can explain—" Nako was silent, his gaze turning towards the mountains. "This will bring you shame," he said softly. The people in town. They already whisper. They will shout then. You will be an outcast. Let them shout, Sarah said, a flare of defiance in her voice. They whispered when I insisted on keeping this ranch after James died. They said a woman couldn't manage it alone. I care more about keeping these children safe than I do about the opinions of fools like Frank Doyle. She straightened her shoulders. I care about what's right, not what's easy. And the boy? Nako asked, his eyes turning back to her. Have you told him you plan to replace his father? The question was a sharp blow, and Sarah flinched. I haven't told him yet, she confessed. And I would never be replacing his father. Just then, Thomas came running from the house, his face bright with excitement, blissfully unaware of the adult storm brewing around him. Nako, are we going to check the traps today? You said you'd show me how to make a deadfall. The warrior's stern expression softened as he looked at the boy. Yes, little hawk. After the morning chores we will go. As Thomas chattered on, Sarah watched them. In 2 short weeks, this Apache warrior had become the center of her son's world. He was a teacher, a protector, a quiet, steady presence that had begun to fill the void James's death had left. Thomas was smiling again. He was laughing. She couldn't let the sheriff take that away from him. After their breakfast, as Nako and Thomas gathered their things, Sarah called her son over to the porch steps. Tommy, I need to talk to you about something very important. His smile faded, replaced by the worried frown she had come to know so well. Is it about the sheriff? Are they coming back for Nako? They might try, Sarah said, choosing her words with care. That's why I've been thinking about a way to make sure Nako and the twins can stay here with us. For good. How? Thomas asked, his eyes wide. I'm thinking of marrying Nako. She saw the confusion and hurt flash across his face and rushed to explain. Not a real marriage, Tommy. Not like with your pa and me. It would be like a partnership. A legal paper that says we're a family so the sheriff can't split us up. Thomas was quiet for a long time, kicking at a loose floorboard. So, he'd be my pa? He asked, his voice small. No one could ever replace your father, Sarah said, her heart aching. Nako would be a guardian, part of our family, someone who helps us, and we help him. Thomas looked over at Nako, who was patiently waiting by the edge of the woods. Then he looked at the house, where the twins were sleeping. He nodded slowly. I think Pa would understand, he said, his voice surprisingly firm. He always told me we have to stand up for what's right, even if it's hard. And the babies need someone. He looked up at her, his eyes shining. Like you took care of me. Sarah pulled him into a fierce hug, burying her face in his sandy hair. Your father would be so proud of you, Thomas. That evening, with the twins asleep in a cradle inside the house, Sarah had insisted they move from the barn after the sheriff's visit. She and Nako sat on the porch, finalizing their insane plan. It's a 3-day journey to Prescott, if we push it, Sarah said, tracing a crude map in the dirt. The town will know we're gone before the sun sets on the first day, Nako observed grimly. Williams at the trading post is a friend, Sarah said, though a seed of doubt had been planted in her mind. I'll go in tomorrow for supplies. I'll ask him to keep quiet. When do we leave? The day after tomorrow. Before dawn. Nako stared into the darkness for a long moment. And if this judge refuses? Sarah hadn't let herself think that far. Then we don't stop. We head west, to California. We'll just keep going. The next day, Sarah rode the wagon into town alone. The air was thick with tension. She felt eyes on her from every window, every doorway. She hitched the wagon outside the trading post and walked in, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt like a lie. Mrs. Thompson, Williams greeted her, his usual smile looking a little strained. What can I get for you? Sarah handed him a list. I need supplies for a long journey, Edward, she said, keeping her voice low. And I need your discretion. Williams's eyebrows shot up. A journey. Does this have anything to do with your visitor? So, the whole town knew. Of course they did. It has everything to do with him, Sarah said, taking a leap of faith. I'm taking him to Prescott. I'm going to marry him. Williams dropped a can of beans. It hit the floor with a loud clang that echoed the shock on his face. You can't be serious, Sarah. Deadly serious, she replied. It's the only way to keep him and those babies off the reservation. The shopkeeper leaned against the counter, shaking his head. Sarah, have you lost your mind? They'll run you out of the territory. You'll be an outcast. I've considered the consequences, she said firmly. Now, are you going to help me, or are you going to stand there gawking? Williams looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. He sighed. James was a good man. He'd want me to look out for you. He started gathering her supplies. I'll keep my mouth shut until tomorrow evening. That's the best I can do for you. As Sarah left the store, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Through the grimy window of the saloon across the street, she saw Sheriff Mills and Frank Doyle leaning over a table, laughing. And as she watched, Williams, the man who had just promised his silence, scurried out of his store and ducked into the saloon, heading straight for their table. He hadn't just been surprised by her plan. He'd been horrified. And he was a man who valued his standing in town more than a promise to a dead friend's widow. He was going to betray them. She didn't have until tomorrow evening. She had until sundown. She whipped the horses into a frantic pace, racing the setting sun back to the homestead, her heart pounding with a single terrifying thought. They had to leave now. That night, as a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, a strange quiet fell over the homestead. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of sleep, but the tense, breathless silence of a world holding its breath. Inside the small cabin, they moved like shadows, packing food, water, and ammunition with frantic, desperate speed. Williams betrayed us, Sarah said, her voice a low, angry hiss as she wrapped the twin babies in extra blankets. He went straight to the sheriff. Nako nodded grimly, checking the action on his own rifle. Men like him value comfort over courage. Thomas, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear, appeared in the doorway. Ma? What's happening? Get dressed. Now, Sarah commanded, her mind a whirlwind of fear and logistics. We have to go. She turned to Nako. There's an old wash that runs behind the property. It leads up into the foothills. It's rough, but a wagon can make it. If we can get there before they circle the house. Nako was already moving, gathering the sleeping twins, his movements economical and swift. I will drive. You take your rifle. They worked in a silent, terrifying harmony, loading the wagon with everything they would need to survive. Sarah grabbed a small wooden box from her mantel. Inside was James's pocket watch and her own wedding ring. She couldn't leave them behind. Just as Nako was hitching the horses, a sound drifted on the night air. A sound that froze the blood in Sarah's veins. Hoofbeats. Many of them. And they were coming fast. They're here, she breathed. Hold on tight, Tommy, she said, lifting her son into the back of the wagon next to the cradle. She climbed onto the seat beside Nako, the rifle heavy across her lap. Nako didn't need to be told. He gave a sharp whistle, and the horses lunged forward, pulling the heavy wagon off the main path and down the steep, rocky embankment into the dry wash. The wagon groaned and shuddered, wheels screaming in protest as they bounced over rocks and through thorny scrub brush. Behind them, the night exploded with light. Torches. A whole swarm of them, descending on her small, empty house. They'll follow when they see we're gone, Sarah said, her voice tight. Yes, Nako said, his face a grim silhouette against the night sky as he expertly guided the horses through the treacherous terrain. But we have a head start, and I know paths through these mountains they will never find. They rounded a sharp bend, and Sarah risked one last look back. She could see the men clearly now, dismounted in her yard, their faces lit by the flickering torchlight. They were angry. This wasn't a sheriff's posse. This was a mob, and Frank Doyle was at the front, shouting and waving his fists. This wasn't about the law anymore. This was about hate. A sudden terrible crack echoed through the wash. The sound of splintering wood came from right behind her head. A bullet. They were shooting at them. Another shot whizzed past, and Nako cursed, urging the horses into a reckless, stumbling gallop. The wagon careened wildly, threatening to tip over with every rock and rut. "They're gaining on us!" Sarah yelled over the thunder of hooves and the screaming of the wagon wheels. The torchlight was getting closer, bouncing and weaving as the mob spurred their horses into the wash behind them. They were trapped. The walls of the wash were too steep to climb. There was nowhere to go but forward. Nako pointed ahead to where the wash forked. The main path was wide and clear. The other was a narrow, jagged split in the rock, barely wide enough for the wagon. "Hold on!" he shouted. He wrenched the reins, pulling the terrified horses off the clear path and into the narrow canyon. The side of the wagon scraped against the rock wall with a hideous, grinding screech. The men behind them roared in frustration as their horses balked at the tight entrance. They were safe, for a moment. But the narrow canyon was a nightmare. Boulders littered the path, and Nako had to navigate them with terrifying precision. They scraped and bounced, the axles groaning under the strain. Then came the sound they had been dreading. A loud, sickening crack, followed by a violent lurch. The wagon slammed to a halt, tilted at a dangerous angle. A wheel had broken. They were stranded. The sounds of the mob, dismounting and coming after them on foot, echoed down the canyon. They were out of time. Nako leaped from the wagon, pulling an axe from their supplies. "Get the children ready to run," he ordered Sarah. "Buy me time." Sarah scrambled into the back of the wagon, her heart pounding. She pulled Thomas close. "No matter what happens, you stay with the babies," she whispered, handing him a small pistol she kept for emergencies. She grabbed her rifle and climbed onto a boulder overlooking the entrance to the narrow pass. She could see the torchlight getting closer. She rested the rifle on the rock, took aim at the canyon wall just above where the men would appear, and waited. The fate of her family would be decided in the next few minutes. The torchlight grew brighter, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar rocks into monstrous shapes. Sarah could hear their voices now, rough and angry, echoing off the canyon walls. Doyle was leading them. "They're in here, trapped like rats," he bellowed. Sarah's hands were slick with sweat. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Behind her, she could hear the frantic sounds of Nako working on the broken wheel, the sharp thud of the axe, a muttered curse. It wasn't fast enough. It would never be fast enough. She peered down the sights of the rifle. She wasn't aiming at a man, not yet. She was aiming at a large, precariously balanced rock formation just above the canyon entrance. It was a desperate, insane idea, but it was the only one she had. The first figures appeared at the mouth of the pass, torches held high, rifles at the ready. It was Doyle and Peterson. "There's the wagon!" Peterson yelled, pointing. Sarah squeezed the trigger. The rifle's kick slammed into her shoulder. The bullet sparked off the canyon wall, exactly where she'd aimed. With a deep, grinding groan, the rock formation above the men began to shift. A shower of pebbles rained down. Doyle and the others looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and terror in the torchlight. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground, tons of rock and earth cascaded down, completely blocking the entrance to the pass. The landslide was a solid, impassable wall of stone. They were safe from the mob, but they were also trapped. The echoes of the rockfall died away, replaced by a deafening silence. Sarah scrambled down from her perch, her body trembling with adrenaline. Nako stared at the wall of rock, then back at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. "The mountain spirit is with you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Or maybe I'm just tired of being pushed around," Sarah shot back, though her voice shook. The immediate danger was gone, but their situation was dire. They were stuck in a canyon with a broken wagon, 2 infants, and no easy way out. They worked through the rest of the night by the light of a single lantern. Nako, using his axe and incredible strength, managed to fashion a crude but functional splint for the broken axle and wheel. It wouldn't last long, but it might get them out of the canyon. By dawn, they were moving again, the wagon limping and groaning with every turn of the damaged wheel. For 3 days, they traveled through a harsh, unforgiving landscape. Nako led them on trails that weren't on any map, paths known only to his people. They crossed sun-scorched mesas and navigated winding, rocky canyons. The damaged wagon made their progress painfully slow. Every jolt, every bump, threatened to shatter their makeshift repair. They were exhausted, hungry, and running low on water. The relief of their escape had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of survival. Thomas was a trooper, helping his mother with the babies without a single complaint. But the strain was starting to show on his young face. He was quieter now, his eyes shadowed with a worry no 10-year-old should ever have to carry. Then, on the third night, a new terror emerged. Kiona, the smaller of the twins, began to cry. It wasn't a cry of hunger, but a thin, pained wail that tore at Sarah's heart. When she touched the baby's forehead, it was burning hot. The fever. The same fever that had taken her mother. The same fever that had taken James. "No," Sarah whispered, a cold dread seeping into her bones. "Not again." They were days from any town, from any doctor. They were utterly alone. Nako's face became a grim mask. He examined the child, his touch surprisingly gentle. "It is the same sickness," he confirmed, his voice heavy. "We must break the fever before the sun rises, or we will lose her." What followed was a desperate battle for a tiny life, fought in the flickering firelight of their miserable camp. Sarah used the homestead remedies her mother had taught her: cool cloths soaked in what little water they had left, a tea brewed from willow bark she found growing near a seep. Nako used the medicine of his own people. He disappeared into the darkness and returned with a pouch of herbs and roots. He crushed them between two stones, creating a pungent poultice that he carefully applied to the baby's chest and feet. He chanted softly in his own tongue, the words a low, rhythmic prayer to the spirits of the mountain. They worked together, a strange alliance of two different worlds, united by their desperate need to save this child. Sarah, with her practical knowledge, and Nako, with his ancient faith. They were no longer a white woman and an Apache man. They were just two parents, fighting off the darkness. Just before dawn, as the first pale light began to touch the eastern sky, the baby's cries softened. The desperate, pained wails subsided into a weak whimper. Sarah touched her forehead again. The fire was gone. The fever had broken. Kiona was sleeping, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Sarah looked at Nako across the fire, her face streaked with dirt and tears. He looked back at her, his own eyes exhausted but filled with a profound relief. They hadn't spoken more than a few necessary words all night, but in that shared look, a bond was forged. It was a bond deeper than any spoken promise, sealed in the crucible of fear and hope. They had faced death together and won. Whatever happened now, they would face it together. The next afternoon, their broken wagon finally crested a high ridge, and there, nestled in the valley below them, was Prescott. It was bigger than Sarah had ever imagined, a sprawling town of brick buildings and bustling streets. They had made it. But as they started the slow, creaking descent into the valley, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their journey and their fight was far from over. The town of Prescott was not the sanctuary Sarah had hoped for. It was just a larger, more crowded version of the prejudice they had fled. As they guided their battered wagon down the main street, a silence fell over the bustling town. People stopped what they were doing and stared. Whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. A white woman, trail-worn and dusty, sitting beside a tall Apache warrior. A white boy, huddled in the back, with two dark-skinned infants. It was a sight so outside the normal order of things that it was treated like a threat. A shopkeeper, standing in his doorway, openly sneered at them. Children pointed. Women pulled their skirts aside as if to avoid contamination. The welcome was as cold and hard as the rocky ground they had just crossed. Nako's posture was rigid, his face an unreadable mask, but Sarah could feel the tension radiating from him. He was a warrior in enemy territory, and every hostile glance was a potential arrow. "We need to find a place to stay," Sarah said, her voice low, "somewhere out of sight." They found a boarding house on a quiet side street, run by a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Caldwell. She looked their strange little group up and down, her lips pursed in disapproval. Sarah didn't bother trying to explain. She simply placed a few precious gold coins, part of the emergency stash James had hidden away, on the counter. Money, she knew, often spoke louder than prejudice. The widow's expression softened slightly. 2 adjoining rooms. Bath is at the end of the hall. Dinner is at 6 o'clock sharp, and no trouble, she added, her sharp eyes lingering on Nako. After washing away days of dust and fear, Sarah felt marginally more human. The twins, bathed and fed, slept peacefully. But the feeling of being under siege remained. "I'll go to the courthouse," Sarah told Nako. "I'll go alone first. It'll cause less of a stir." Nako nodded, though he clearly didn't like the idea of her facing this world alone. "Be careful," he warned. "Their rules are not our rules." At the courthouse, a grand brick building that seemed to mock her with its air of solid, unmovable authority, Sarah was directed to the clerk's office. The clerk was a young man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a self-important air. When Sarah stated her business, he looked at her as if she had just grown a second head. "A marriage license?" he repeated, his voice dripping with condescension. "Between yourself and an Apache?" He said the word Apache as if it were a foul curse. "Yes," Sarah said, her chin held high. "Is Judge Franklin Harrison available?" "The judge's docket is full for the foreseeable future," the clerk said dismissively, not even bothering to look at his schedule. "And the territory of Arizona does not grant marriage licenses to that sort. Perhaps you should reconsider your arrangement." He was about to say more, something cruel and dismissive, when a deep voice boomed from a nearby doorway. "Is that James Thompson's widow?" A tall, gray-haired man in judicial robes stood there, his face stern, his eyes sharp and intelligent. It was Judge Harrison. Sarah's heart leaped. "Judge Harrison, yes," she said, stepping forward. "You remember me." "I remember your husband," the judge corrected her. "A good man. Stood for what was right." His eyes narrowed, taking in her disheveled appearance. "My clerk tells me you are seeking a rather unusual legal remedy." "I am, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "The circumstances are also unusual. May I have a moment of your time? In private?" The judge studied her for a long, silent moment. The clerk smirked, certain she was about to be thrown out. But then, the judge gave a curt nod. "My chambers, now." For the next hour, Sarah poured out the entire story. She told him everything: Nako, the twins, the fever, the corrupt Indian agent, the sheriff, the mob, their terrifying escape. She left nothing out. The judge listened without interruption, his face impassive, his fingers steepled under his chin. When she was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. "So, this proposed marriage is a legal fiction," he stated, his voice flat. "A shield to protect this man and his children from an unjust system." "Yes," Sarah acknowledged. "Though we have become partners in survival." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Thompson, what you are proposing is not just irregular, it is a direct challenge to the established order of this territory. Intermarriage, while not explicitly illegal, is a social taboo of the highest order. Granting such a license would cause an uproar." Sarah's newfound hope began to crumble. "So, you won't help us?" "I did not say that," the judge said, rising from his chair. He paced to the window, looking out over the town. "I have long held the private belief that the reservation system is a moral failure. We take a proud people, strip them of their lands, and then force them to live as beggars, dependent on the whims of corrupt agents." He turned back to her, his eyes blazing with a sudden fire. "The law should be a shield for the innocent, Mrs. Thompson, not a weapon for the cruel." He made a decision. "Bring your Apache friend and his children to my home, tonight, 8 o'clock. My wife will want to meet them. We will discuss what is to be done." That evening, they walked up the hill to the judge's grand house. Mrs. Harrison, a kind woman with gentle eyes, greeted them at the door. She didn't flinch at the sight of Nako. Instead, she immediately cooed over the twins, taking Kiona into her arms. "Oh, the precious little things," she said, her voice warm. While Sarah and Mrs. Harrison spoke in the parlor, the judge led Nako into his study and closed the door. The waiting was agony. Sarah could hear the low murmur of their voices, but couldn't make out the words. She imagined an interrogation, a grilling, the judge testing Nako, searching for a reason to deny them. After what felt like an eternity, the study door opened. The judge's face was serious. Sarah held her breath. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice formal. "I have had a frank discussion with Nako. I believe his story. I believe he is a man of honor." He paused, and Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. "However, I cannot grant you a marriage license." The words hit her like a physical blow. It was over. All of it, the running, the fighting, it had all been for nothing. "A marriage," the judge continued, "would be too easily contested by your enemies. They would claim you were coerced, or that he was unfit. It would put you all in even greater danger." He sat down, leaning forward. "But there is another way, a legal path that is more secure, more permanent." Sarah looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "There is land," the judge said, a new excitement in his voice. "A homestead grant in the Northern Territory, near the Colorado border. The government is eager to have it settled." He looked from Sarah to Nako. "I can issue a partnership homestead grant, in both your names. It would make you legal business partners, joint owners of 320 acres of land. As landowners and ranchers, you would be contributing to the territory. Civilized enterprise." "And the reservation orders?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to hope. "As a landowning man engaged in a civilized enterprise, he would be exempt," the judge said, a small triumphant smile on his face. "I will issue a judicial exemption personally. It will be ironclad." A partnership. It was brilliant. It gave them everything they needed: land, security, and legal protection, without the social complications of a marriage. "The children," Sarah said, her mind racing. "The twins would be registered as your legal wards," the judge explained, "with Nako recognized as their father, with his full parental rights legally affirmed and protected." 2 days later, they stood in the judge's chambers and signed the papers. It felt surreal. The heavy official documents gave them a new home, a new life. As he affixed his official seal, the judge looked at them. "This is highly irregular," he admitted. "But sometimes irregular times call for irregular solutions. Go now. Build a good life. Prove them all wrong." As they left the courthouse, the papers clutched safely in Sarah's bag. The future suddenly seemed possible again. They were no longer running from the law. For the first time, the law was on their side. That night, as they prepared for the long journey north to Pine Valley, Sarah found Nako on the boarding house porch, watching the stars come out. "Are you sure about this?" she asked him softly. "It won't be easy. There will still be people who hate us for what we are." He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the night sky. "My people have a saying," he replied. "It is better to have less thunder in the mouth and more lightning in the hand. We have chosen to act, to build. Words are just wind." He finally turned to look at her, and in the faint starlight she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not just gratitude, but a deep, abiding respect. "Your father was a wise man, Sarah Thompson. He raised a wise woman." A comfortable silence fell between them. "What will we tell them?" Sarah wondered aloud, thinking of the 2 baby girls sleeping inside. "When they're older? About all of this?" Nako considered this for a moment. "We will tell them the truth," he said. "That when they needed a mother, one came. That when a boy needed a father, one came. We will tell them that a family is not always made of blood. Sometimes it is made of courage." His words were so simple, so true, that they brought tears to her eyes. This strange, broken, and beautiful little group wasn't a legal fiction or a partnership on paper. They were a family. Forged in fire and fear, bound by choice and hope. The journey ahead would be long. The life they were building would be hard. But as Sarah stood there beside this quiet, powerful man, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that they were finally going home. The journey to Pine Valley was different. The desperation was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined hope. They had a better wagon, purchased with gold Nako had produced, traded from skills and secrets he kept to himself. They had legal papers that felt like a shield. For 3 weeks they traveled north, leaving the harsh desert behind for rolling grasslands and eventually, the cool, dark green of the high country. They spoke more during that journey than they had in all the frantic weeks before. They shared stories of their pasts, of James and his dreams, of Nako's wife and her laughter. They were two people from two different worlds, slowly, carefully, building a bridge between them. Thomas thrived, soaking up Nako's lessons about the new plants and animals they encountered. He was becoming strong and confident, the shadows of grief receding from his eyes. When they finally arrived in Pine Valley, it was more beautiful than any of them had dared to imagine. It was a lush, green valley, cradled by snow-capped mountains, with a crystal-clear river running through its center. Their 320 acres were perfect, a mix of rich pastureland and tall pines. It felt like the edge of the world. It felt like a fresh start. As they stood on a ridge, looking down at their new home, a sense of peace settled over Sarah for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. They had done it. They had found their sanctuary. But as her eyes scanned the valley, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. A thin ribbon of smoke, rising from a small cabin tucked away in the trees on the far side of the river. They weren't alone. Nako had seen it too. His body went still, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the landscape. He slid off his horse and knelt, studying the ground. He pointed to a set of tracks in the dirt, nearly invisible to Sarah's eyes. A rider has been this way, recently, watching. A cold feeling, a familiar dread, began to creep back into Sarah's heart. This place was supposed to be their escape. It was supposed to be safe. Nako looked at her, his face grim, the brief peace shattered. He had learned things in Prescott, made inquiries while she was busy with the legal papers. He had learned about the lawman assigned to this remote northern district. He had hoped it was just a coincidence, a different man with the same name. But now, seeing that cabin, seeing those tracks, he knew it wasn't. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and hard. "The territorial marshal assigned to this district, the man in that cabin, it is Sheriff Mills." Their old enemy had not been left behind. He had arrived before them. They had not escaped him at all. They had walked right into his new jurisdiction. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But this time, Sarah thought, as she looked at her son, at the two babies sleeping in the wagon, at the warrior standing beside her, this time was different. They weren't running. They were on their own land. They had the law on their side. And they were a family. They would stand their ground. They would fight. They would build their home. Whatever came next, they would face it together. If you enjoyed this story of survival and the creation of an unlikely family, please let us know in the comments. And for more stories that explore the light and dark of human nature, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching.